Hi everyone, my name's Wyatt and I'm a musician, a violist, violinist, conductor and more recently a composer as well. And on top of that I'm also a programmer. So I'm going to be speaking today a little bit about my practice, focusing on a work that I'm putting together for Speak Percussion and outlining some of the tech behind how it works and my process. So, a bit about how I got here and my background. I originally actually started a double degree in biomedical science and electronic engineering. And so all throughout high school, I kind of had this science focus. I'd been involved in the Chem Olympiad program and a few other things like that. And a bit of a nerd, obviously, as well as doing, playing within the youth orchestra system for many, many years. So I had kind of that big interest in classical music, which then sort of moved into more contemporary and art music as well as this sort of background and interest in tech, in programming, in science. So throughout high school, I just sort of tinkered around doing various bits of programming here and there. And then when I got to uni, took that a bit further, but only ended up doing 1 year of science and engineering before I switched to music. I was sort of getting to an age where I was ultimately going to be too old for the youth orchestra in a few years. Couldn't imagine not having symphonic music in my life. And around the same time had just switched to viola from violin and had been asked to start doing some gigs and thought, well, I could actually make a living out of this. And I'd sort of breezed through high school and discovered that once you get to uni, it doesn't really work quite so well. You actually have to start studying and actually applying yourself. And if it was a choice between hitting the books or hitting the practice room, I chose the practice room, and here I am. But on the plus side, I've kind of kept up on the tech side of things. So, and have recently, well, I say recently, but actually it started probably almost a decade ago now, so it feels recently, but it's just showing my age. I still feel like the year 2000 is just a few years back when it really wasn't. Anyhow, I digress. But about a decade ago, I got involved in the Decibel New Music Ensemble, and it's a new music group that was originally based in Perth. Half of the members are now in Melbourne, half of the members are still in Perth, and so we do a lot of project-based works. So, previously we used to have more regular rehearsals when all the group members are in Perth. These days we'll sort of set aside a week or so, travel somewhere, rehearse for a specific program, and then put on the concert. And as a new music ensemble, it involved a lot of tech. So there was live processing of audio, there were pre-recorded electronic parts. One of the premises of the ensemble is that it's an electroacoustic ensemble. So the works always involved a mixture of our acoustic instruments and electronic sounds. And it wasn't that all of the acoustic instruments were amplified in any way. Generally what would happen is if there was any capture of them, it would be for audio processing, so changing the sound, adding delay, reverb, doing all sorts of synthesis process and manipulating the audio in various ways. And that would then come out through speakers that were usually positioned on the stage. So the electronic sounds were kind of treated as if they were part of the ensemble and blended with the ensemble as if they were just a part of standard sort of chamber music. So alongside the audio processing, another way that the ensemble used tech was for our scores. A lot of the works that Kat Hope, the ensemble director, was doing at the time were very sort of long, drony works. So there'd often be these long, sustained notes, and if there were changes in pitch, often they'd happen slowly with this glissandi up and down, gradually changing pitch. So this very sort of soundscape kind of environment. And actually writing that in traditional notation isn't really intuitive, it's not really useful, especially when there's sort of no constant sense of pulse. The problem is, of course, everything still has to have this temporal relationship within the ensemble. Parts still need to line up, but it's lining up over a long duration. And as musicians, generally we get trained with very sort of regular beats, very short sort of time intervals. We're always subdividing. So we're really good at that. But actually having something move over a long time is something that we're maybe not so well trained at. And trying to coordinate that becomes a really difficult process. And so what we ended up doing was we used, Lindsay Vickery and Stuart James, two of the ensemble members, used this program Max MSP, which is mostly an audio programming language, but it can do visuals as well. And they would take these long images that Kat had created and set them in motion across the screen. And so you might have a line that was representing this particular part, undulating up and down very, very slowly. And the player would follow that, and as this line hit the playhead, they'd interpret what the pitch was. And of course there were other ways, like the thickness of line often represented dynamics. Parts would be color-coded, so different colors for different parts, so you could still see the full score. How opaque or translucent the line was, or how faint it was, would often indicate other timbral elements. So there were all of these different, I guess, musical parameters encoded into the score, into the colors that we used, into the shapes of the lines, into the thickness of the lines. And this proved to be a really, really useful way of syncing things together. But it meant that we had to have laptops on stage. We were reading off of them. They're kind of bulky. There's a bit of a barrier there between us and the audience. Ideally, what we wanted to do was to move everything to tablets and to the iPad. Because of course, this you can just whack on a music stand, much in the same way as you just put a piece of paper on a stand. So it was far less obtrusive. It was much easier to read off. And also we were having some issues with networking with the patches that we were using. Things weren't always reliable. And so the group got a grant to sort of develop their own score playing application. And around the same time, we'd also been putting together this sort of interpretation of the John Cage variations. So these are a series of works. So often when you think variations, you think theme and variations, and where a composer's taken a theme and then they've written a series of variations, and it's just the one piece. Cage took a slightly different approach on this. So these variations were each individual pieces, often written with years between them. I think over a couple of decades, actually, from the variation 1 to variation 8. So quite a long period of time. Each one experimenting with different ideas that he was playing around with at the time. So for example, in variation 3, and a lot of them use chants. So in variation 3, you would have these transparency circles. If any of you are old enough to remember what an overhead projector is, probably not. But anyway, this transparent plastic with these circles printed on them. You would cut out the circles and just drop them randomly on the floor, on a surface, on a table. And the largest group of touching circles became the score. And so basically we just transported this to the computer. So rather than having to cut out transparencies, you can just get a computer to generate a bunch of circles on the screen, work out what the largest touching group of circles is, and then fade out all of the other ones. And Stu and Lindsay were having a bit of difficulty actually programming this to work. And because of my previous programming experiences and knowing that you could use Java and other languages in Max that were maybe more suited to the task of finding this group of circles, I offered to help and got involved in that. And then that worked and went really well. And I got brought in on the app development. So I hadn't done any iOS programming before that point in time, but knew enough programming that I understood the concepts, could gradually pick up the language, gradually work out all the libraries that are involved, the Apple-specific libraries that are involved on the iPad, and piece something together. And from there, I sort of became the main developer and then the sole developer of the app. And it's still an ongoing project to this day. In fact, I'll still be doing some additional coding for the Speak project to just add some new sort of ways of being able to animate scores to it. So that became, as I said, my main sort of programming project and a large part of what I did with the ensemble, as well as, of course, playing viola or violin, depending on what the pieces needed. So that was I was kind of content for that to just be the programming that I did. Anything else was just side projects and hobbies that were unrelated to music. And then, of course, 2020 came, and we all know what that brought with it. Suddenly, well, especially for those of you in Melbourne, you would have known that live music became something very scarce and something that we couldn't really do. And I'd thankfully used this program called JackTrip before, which is a program designed to transport audio over the internet with as little latency as possible. So with as little delay in the sound from one end to the other. And it's technically a hard challenge, and I'll get into that probably in the next episode. But thankfully I'd had some experience with that and thought it'd be great to use that and just play some live music again with some friends, some colleagues, all that kind of stuff. Because I'd been invited to do a few Zoom music projects, and that is not fun in the slightest. And it's not just because Zoom has, high latency and there's this delay and you can never sync things. It's also just because the audio quality is so, compressed. There's very little nuance in the sound. Often, it's, to their credit, it has gotten better, over the course of the pandemic, and it's much better than it was. But certainly at the start of the pandemic, Zoom audio quality was not great. And certainly when you were trying to do improvised things, even things that worked okay with latency, there were problems where if you had more than 3 people playing at once, for instance, one of those people would then drop out. So there are a limited number of audio streams that you can hear at once, which is really hard if you have an ensemble split across really multiple locations. So I'd had experience with JackTrip and had used it for some other sort of telematic performances previously with huge success, and knew the audio quality was great, knew that it did a good job of bringing the latency down. But the real problem with it is that it was at that stage very much a research project. So it's a program that's been developed out of Stanford, and it was originally a command line program. So if you think back to really old computers, like a DOS or a Unix terminal, you would have to type commands to make things work. So to get JackTrip running on one end and the other, you would have to type JackTrip and then a couple of command line switches on one end, and a set of different command line switches on the other end. For technical users, that's pretty straightforward and not a problem. But when you start talking to musician colleagues who have never had to deal with a command line before, and you start telling them about the process to get this happening, I would tell them about this and say we should totally play a duet together, and start explaining the process, and you would kind of just see their eyes slowly glaze over, and you'd know at that point that you'd lost them. And it was like, I just want to play music with someone at this stage. So one of the things that I'd done initially when I was trying to get this just to work for my own testing was I discovered there were a few minor issues with the program, a few bugs here and there. And as well as being a research project, it's also an open source project, which means that anyone can go online, see all of the code to JackTrip, and then change the code however they want. So I thought I'd take a quick look at it and see if I could hunt down this one little annoying bug that existed. Nothing major, but just there was a command line option that wasn't being honored in a particular mode. Hunted it down, fixed it, and that was great. And then through the process of doing that, I started to become a little more familiar with the code and sort of thought, well, what else could I fix? So started to fix up some of the networking stuff, modernized it a bit, started just changing some of the I guess behind the scenes parts of the code just to make things a little bit more efficient and reliable. And then and I got in touch with the people at Stanford and said, hey, I've made these changes, you're welcome to have them back, if I can contribute somehow. And they were totally on board with that. So I got brought into the development team there, ended up giving a few talks at Stanford, obviously online. And because of the time difference, they became very accustomed to seeing me sort of bleary-eyed in my sort of pastel blue and flamingo dressing gown, which it's funny, I could get away with that at Stanford, but I wouldn't try that at my usual job. So, was able to give a few talks there and to meet the team, and I've currently still got a standing invite to head out there and actually meet them all in person once travel's permitting again, which will hopefully be in the not too distant future. But after making those changes, the next thing that I really wanted to do was to sort of make it a little bit friendlier for just musicians to use. And so rather than being a command line application, I added a graphical user interface to it. So now, instead of having to go to a terminal window and type a bunch of commands, you can basically just double click an icon, if you're on Mac or Windows, and it also works on Linux, so it's very cross-platform. You can run it on basically whatever computer, whatever hardware you've got. And so it allowed people to just access all of the settings that you normally could via the command line, but with a bunch of sort of cryptic sort of -C, -S, all those sorts of things. Here you could just tick a box and the option would be checked. And that way, and you could also just enter a server name and connect to it. And so it actually became much easier for musicians to use, to the point where then I was able to sort of bring it into the course at Monash. So now we have an improvisation ensemble that looks at improvising in these slightly higher latency conditions. So when you can't be guaranteed that you're going to be absolutely in sync. And the students are able to use this technology and play with it and really explore this online space, this sort of virtual performance environment, this virtual practice room, getting used to thinking about how a work might sound when there is that sort of variability in time and when there are these different perspectives depending on exactly which part of the network you're on.